This lecture is going to cover some basics about pediatric nutrition. This is a topic that's been covered to some extent in other coursework, so I'll sort of point to some other things as well throughout the lecture, but to give some basics on pediatric nutrition. So first of all, when we think about nutrition in infants, children's, up through adolescents, and particularly infants and young children, I think we want to consider whether we're talking about normal growth and development, or are we talking about sort of non-normal pediatric health conditions? So whether that's an illness or a chronic diagnosis or something else going on. So we'll kind of first go through some of what you would expect in normal growth and development and nutrition assessment in those infants and children, and then we'll shift to some of those non-normal conditions or health conditions that may come up. So normal growth and development in infancy, this is just some averages for full-term infants to give you a little bit of an idea. Average birth weight, 7.5 pounds, average length about 20 inches, head circumference here. And then it's very normal for full-term infants to lose weight in the first couple weeks of life, about 10% of their body weight if they're a full-term infant. And then by about 10 days to 2 weeks after birth, they're back to their full normal birth weight. So that's normal and expected to be seen. So again, some of these things are just trying to recognize what would be normal and what would be a red flag that something isn't going well. So when we look at assessing growth in infants, there are a variety of growth charts. The CDC and WHO growth charts are the most commonly used for developmentally normal children, average children and infants. So both of those are available online, and I'm assuming that you have covered those in previous coursework, but just as a reminder, that's really the key for assessing growth. And then there are some specialty growth charts for situations like Down syndrome and prematurity. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those other health conditions in a bit, but just being aware that there are some different growth charts there. So in terms of average growth, birth weight typically doubles at about 6 months of age and triples at about 1 year. Again, just to get an idea of what's sort of average or normal. And length increases by an average of about 1 inch per month. So over the course of the year, you would expect in the first year of their life for them to grow at an average of about 12 inches. Again, here's a little bit more details in terms of average growth in infants. So the first two rows are preterm infants, and again, we'll talk a little bit more with specific health conditions, some of the specifics with preterm babies. But down in this lower portion of the chart here, you see sort of the normal growth and development in month breakdown. So how many grams per day you could expect the infant to be gaining. And again, that doesn't mean they're going to gain that exactly every day, but to get an assessment if they're on track here. And then weight, how many centimeters per week they would be expected to grow. And then this is the increase in head circumference on average per week. So this could be used in assessing an infant's growth. In terms of other nutrition assessment factors, when you are assessing nutrition for infants, it's really important to think about the big picture. So definitely assessing their length, weight, head circumference, and their growth along that, plotting them on a growth chart to see if they're tracking for where they were, if they were at the 25th percentile, that they kind of keep tracking around there or whatever. I think it's also really important to think about other sort of some of the environmental factors. So in infants, if we're kind of thinking about infants, that feeding environment, infants really should be held when they're fed. Bottles shouldn't be propped up. They need that, holding and snuggling along with them. So really thinking about that feeding environment, the bonding that's going on at home, all of those sorts of things are important and impact nutrition. It's also important to get an assessment if the parent or caregiver is able to recognize the infant's cues for hunger and respond to those. So when the baby's hungry, that they get fed, and that when they're not hungry, there's some other measures used for soothing. So every time a baby cries doesn't necessarily mean they're hungry. So just kind of getting an assessment if the parent or caregiver is starting to sort of build that understanding of their baby's cues, and that takes a little bit of time, and certainly there's not one perfect way to do it, but all of those things are important in terms of thinking of other nutrition assessment of infants. Something else, thinking about sort of food safety and sanitation surrounding their feeding, particularly if the infant is on formula, and we'll talk about formula in a little bit, but if they're mixing formula, you need to be thinking about if the water they're using is clean and safe, if they're diluting the formula appropriately, all of those types of things. So particularly if there's any concerns with growth or the infant receiving adequate nutrition, really thinking about the whole environment and what goes on related to the feeding, the frequency, the quantity, the timing, the feeding environment, all of those types of things are important to consider. So then when we think about estimating nutrient needs, so kind of calculating calorie and protein requirements for infants, here's some guidelines broken down from 0 to 3 months, 4 to 6, and 7 to 12 months. So just a calculation there for calorie needs and then estimated protein requirements. So you can see as they age, they start out with a higher gram per kilogram protein requirement, and then once they reach about that 12 months, that's really similar in grams per kilo that they will need for quite some time actually. So then a question of sort of what to feed baby. So again, initially when a baby is born, that is a decision that every parent and family needs to make. So breast milk really is the most nutritionally quote unquote normal food for infants. And I put that there just that that's sort of the physiological way that the human body and many animal bodies were made to feed their young. So that's why I say it's the most nutritionally normal. It's sort of how it was intended. Does that mean it's absolutely what everyone is going to do, or that there's any, I mean, it doesn't mean that there aren't reasons that people choose not to breastfeed or that sort of thing. But in terms of just kind of physiologically what's normal, breast milk is the most normal, and it definitely has a lot of advantages to it. The American Academy of Pediatric recommends breastfeeding exclusively for about the first 6 months, and then within that time, between 4 and 6 months, we'll be introducing some foods as well, and I apologize, I see I have a typo, continuing until at least 1 year of age. We're going to have a separate lecture on breastfeeding. That's sort of such a specialty area that I think deserves a little bit specific attention, so we'll talk about that a little bit more separately. But if the family is not breastfeeding, then infant formula is the only thing that should be used in terms of sort of the milk, what people think of often as milk, in that first year. So infants should not receive cow's milk, goat's milk, those types of things. It should be specific infant formula. If they are on formula, then in that first 4 to 6 months, it should be just formula, and then again adding some other complementary foods, but continuing with the formula, not switching to milk until the infant turns at least 1 year of age, or 1 year of age. I shouldn't say at least, 1 year is a good time to switch to that. So for formula-fed infants, we want to use iron with formula. So breast milk has less iron, but it's much more absorbable. And so with formula, you want to use an iron formula unless it's contraindicated because of an iron storage disease, which is actually quite rare. Sometimes parents will feel like iron causes their babies to have constipation. Usually there are other things we can help them work through. And so it's not recommended to go to a non-iron formula. Even if there's issues with constipation, then we need to kind of talk about, are they really having constipation? What defines constipation? Is there, enough formula total being given? Is it being diluted properly? All of those sorts of things. So in terms of formula amounts, just to give an idea, this isn't absolutely that every infant will be exactly like this, but again, it's helpful to have a sense of approximate quantities. So a general guideline is the infant's age in month plus 2 to 3 ounces that they would be using in that first 6 months of life. So a couple examples here, if the baby was 3 months old, then we'd do the 3 plus the 2 to 3 ounces to say, okay, it's probably going to be about 5 to 6 ounces per feeding. One thing I think is important, though, is that parents don't get so locked into these numbers that they either restrict when the baby is more hungry than that or push when the baby's less hungry than that. It's still important to recognize those infant feeding cues to decide when baby has had enough and when they maybe need more than is sort of that average. Again, we want to think about potential costs, any allergies, preparation, cleanliness, all of that surrounding the formula, and thinking of those general food safety guidelines. There are a variety of types of infant formulas available. For most full-term healthy infants, a standard cow milk-based formula is going to be perfectly appropriate, of course, as we talked about with the iron added. But there are a variety of other formulas, preterm, transitional formulas, soy formulas, and then a variety of specific if there's a particular inborn error of metabolism or something like that. The Pediatric Nutrition Care Manual from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has very nice specific table on indications for the various types of formulas, so when you might choose a different formula. But again, for most infants, the standard cow milk-based formula is going to be appropriate. There are some vitamin and minerals that should be supplemented for full-term infants in that first year of life. So all infants in the United States get vitamin K, a single dose at birth as a shot. And then vitamin D should be provided both to infants on human milk or breast milk or infants fed formula. So once they get up to a certain amount of formula for formula fed infants, that vitamin D will be in the formula. However, breast milk, breastfed babies should be given that vitamin D throughout, and the 400 IUs a day is what is recommended. Iron recommendations, again, are given here, generally starting at about that 4 to 6 months for infants being breastfed, because that's when the iron stores that they've laid down are really depleting and they need a food source of iron. And then, again, fluoride, if the water that they are on does not have adequate fluoride. So generally, city water has the fluoride added, but for individuals on well water, they would need to supplement that fluoride. Complementary foods, so sometimes we think of this as quote unquote solid foods, really anything other than breast milk or formula can begin somewhere between 4 and 6 months of age. Infants should be showing signs of developmental readiness for solid foods, and I think this area has been covered in other coursework, so I'm not going to repeat it here, but it's something to be aware of in terms of how to introduce solid foods, what foods are appropriate, what foods they need. This is definitely a lot less rigid in the recommendations than it used to be. But something to just refresh if it's been a while since you've had that in your coursework. This slide, again, is some information that you've probably previously had, but I think it's helpful to look at some of the typical quantities of foods and portions at different times in life. And it's helpful as you educate families for them to be aware of what's a reasonable portion for the infant or child. So they're very, their tummies are very small, so they can't hold a lot at one time. So basically, early in life, they're eating very frequently. So for example, in the 0 to 4 month age range, particularly early on, they're only taking maybe a couple ounces of formula and feeding between 8 and 12 times a day. So that's really frequent feeding. And so it's helpful particularly for new parents to realize that's normal for the babies to be eating that often. And it does mean for being tired sometimes and feeling like you're constantly feeding, but that just is normal. So anyway, just kind of some guidelines here on typical daily intakes. So that kind of wraps up that first year of life. And then we move into more the older infancy, toddler, preschool age. So here are some average growth patterns for older infants and children. So again, this starts at about that 20 months age, so a year and a half or so, how much you could expect that they would be gaining in terms of weight and height and head circumference. And then going, there's guidelines here up to 10 years. Also a reminder, again, I know you've covered growth charts, but that those growth charts can be used all the way throughout childhood and adolescence in terms of tracking height, weight for height, and BMI growth charts starting at age 2. So that the growth charts really are a core way to assess growth, and important also to just be refreshed that you're really looking for patterns on those growth charts. So it's not so much one point in time as it is watching that the child follows their own growth trend. So if they're typically mapping along at the 75th percentile, then if they make a big jump up or a big drop down is when that would sort of draw a red flag. In terms of estimating calorie needs for children, it can be challenging because it really is quite highly variable based on the activity level. So there's a couple of resources I'm going to point you to that I think provide some great information. Again, that Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Pediatric Nutrition Care Manual has a calculator in there that you can plug in the child's weight, height, age, gender, all of that, and it will provide a calculation for you. And you can also plug in the activity level there. And then there's a PDF document that I've linked here that provides a nice table of just approximate calorie requirements at different ages and activity levels. So just be kind of familiar with how to estimate those needs based on their activity level. Again, in terms of assessment, when you're deciding on activity level, I think it's important to really get a feel for what exactly is happening with activity, because it could, different people could have different interpretations of what's highly active, moderately active, etc. So really getting a good, clear picture of what's going on in terms of physical activity. In terms of nutrient needs for adolescents, as kids get a little older, this table is just DRIs. Again, this isn't something to memorize everything on the screen, but to have an idea. So it is a little bit different for males and females. And then in this table, basically how it works with the DRIs, the reference weight would be kind of a 50th percentile type weight for that age group. So in this case, males age 9 to 11, 36 kilos would be sort of a reference weight. And then here's the resting energy expenditure, so that's not considering physical activity, at 36 calories per kilo, and then 49 calories per kilo assuming a sort of a normal activity level. So that just kind of gives you a sense. This would be a general number that you could use in terms of calories per kilo for males ages 9 to 11, and so forth through the table. In terms of the protein requirements over here, you can see really throughout all of these between 0.85 and 0.95 grams per kilo. So we're really talking, getting pretty close to that 1 gram per kilo that we saw before, and then the RDA for adults 0.8 grams per kilo, but right in that range is sort of a good number to keep in your mind. Again, other assessment factors when we're looking at children and up through adolescence, certainly, again, that feeding environment. When we think about environment, we want to think about everything from, are they, sitting down to eat? Are they eating in front of the TV? Who are they eating with? Are meal times pleasant? Are they stressful? All of those kinds of things. Food security and access to healthy foods. So, in terms of economic situation, do they have enough food, or even if they have the economics to provide enough food, is there actually enough food present for the children? Is the food available at regular times? Is there structure to the eating environments? Are kids, kind of given free rein to the pantry, or do they, is that provided for them? So just kind of all those things related to how food is provided. And then the knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, both of the children and of their families and caregivers, can have a big impact, whether people feel like, a certain food is bad or a certain food is good, or, all of those types of things. Really getting an assessment of all of that is helpful. Again, especially if there is something going on with growth and development or nutritional status, you really want to think about the whole picture. In terms of nutrition deficiencies, this just gives some nutrition deficiency, physical signs of nutrition deficiencies that can be seen in children. Really, to some extent, many of these are seen in adults, can be seen in adults as well, but just something to kind of be aware of if you see these in children, that, to be a red flag of a potential nutrition deficiency. And then finally, in terms of nutrition education, once more, I'm going to point you back to the Pediatric Nutrition Care Manual. This has an excellent section on client education. There's a tab or area for client education and diets that has a lot of education materials that I think is helpful to review, probably for yourself as well, just to really get a sense of some of the different aspects of different conditions, I guess, and things you might recommend to families. So I would encourage you to scan through those, both for the information and an awareness of things you have available to share with families. So that kind of sums up the section on pediatric nutrition for what we would consider normal growth and development. And so then I'm going to do a separate little lecture on more nutrition-related health issues that are commonly seen in pediatrics.